Hey guys, I'm Drago, and today I bring you another bit of Springtrap art. I know, not a surprise, who would have guessed? If I sound off at all in this video, by the way, I am quite tired at the moment. Had a bit of an iffy week. I'm actually recording this voiceover on the day that I'm supposed to upload it, so I still gotta edit it and get it done for the upload time. And I am just so tired, so I'm sat here like, Gonna keep this intro short and sweet. It's another Springtrap piece. This is for my promise of monthly Springtrap art for the year of Springtrap. Next month is going to be the last month of it, so comment down below. What would you like to see me do for the last bit of Springtrap art for this year? Give me your suggestions, because I am fresh out of ideas. Anyways, without further delay, let's go on with the speed paint. So as I always do with sort of larger, more complex pieces, I started off by going to Blender and making myself a reference. I absolutely love the Springtrap model. I always use it. It's from Rue36, and I apologise for saying your name wrong in the last video. So I actually decided to make the rim itself. That way I could get perspective and positioning correct. So I just made a cube and sized it and put Springtrap in there. I also did a bunch of cubes for where the presents would go. I'm doing that corridor in FNAF 3, you've got those presents in the corner. So just doing cubes to make sure I can get the stacking and perspective and angles of that right. Just help myself out basically. With my reference sorted and sized properly, I was able to get on to starting to do some sketching. I started off by just mapping out the general room, doing this with my reference image underlaid underneath it to make sure everything is at the right perspective. Because let me tell you, I absolutely suck at backgrounds. I just can never get things right. I can never get perspective right. I can never get it to look good, which is why I went into Blender and posed all this and made all these cubes just so I could get everything looking all right. I didn't want this to look like the cubes were too big or too small, or the wall and the ceiling and floor don't look right together, or Springtrap doesn't look like he's actually, you know, part of the scene. Because sometimes it happens that the character doesn't look like they're part of the scene, it just looks like they're sort of photoshopped on top. And I wanted to make sure it looked like he was within this setting. When moving on to doing the rough underlay sketch for Springtrap, I was very meticulous to make sure the proportions were right. I did occasionally put the image back underneath just to make sure I had things in the right place. Mainly Springtrap's positioning, I wasn't directly tracing over him, just getting that positioning correct. So like making sure just he is basically in the correct place in the background. I know I keep saying that. I'm tired. I don't know what else to say. But yeah, enjoy me spending literally like an hour just trying to get this underlay sketch correct. With everything mapped out, it was time for a more detailed sketch, which took me 2 hours just for the sketch. I was going to do Springtrap first, but then I decided actually I'm going to do the background first. Mainly because at the time I just was looking at Springtrap and I was thinking this is going to be complicated. So I thought I'll just do the background first. It can act as a warm-up before I move on to the more complicated character. So basically I got a reference of the FNAF 3 location, the corridor that I wanted it to be in, and I just started laying it all out. I really struggled to get the ribbons on the presents right. Like, of all things to struggle with, it was ribbons on presents. Like, why did my brain have trouble with that? But I decided, does it need to be perfect? Not really. There's actually going to be flames that are covering this bit up mostly, so they're not going to have that much focus on them. I mean, the viewer's eye is mostly going to be on Sprint and the fire around him probably, so I decided that if they look wrong, they look wrong. As long as the general idea is there, it's good enough. What else did I struggle with? Oh, Chica. Chica. I don't know why I struggle so much to draw her sometimes. I think it's because she's got such a different head to everyone else. I mean, if you compare her to the other FNAF 1 gang, Freddy and Bonnie have got their cheeks. You've got Foxy has got his tufts of fur. But Chica is this quite round head. So I got a rough shape in there. I decided to put sort of tufts of feathers up on the top just to kind of help myself with the angle and visualising how that's going to go. But as soon as I moved on to putting the beak in, I just couldn't get it at the right angle. I couldn't visualise that in my head for some reason. It took so many tries to just eventually get it to where it looked realistic. I've never enjoyed drawing Chica, honestly. She's just a difficult one for me. But eventually I sort of realised what I was doing wrong with the beak. I was just sort of trying to slap it on there. I wasn't really thinking about the angle. Well, I was, but I wasn't doing it in a correct way. No, what I was doing was I wasn't thinking about the angle correctly. So I was thinking that she'd be looking a bit more at the camera. But in reality, that beak would be facing to the left a little bit more. She'd turn to the left a little bit more. And so I was thinking of it as the eyes wouldn't be touching or be under the beak in terms of perspective at all. But in reality, the beak, at least the hump of the beak at the top, would be overlapping one of the eyes. And as soon as I realised that, I was able to get the actual shape in there properly and get it looking okay. Again, she was going to be mostly covered up by fire, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but I was still like, no, it's got to be right. I can't have it looking absolutely awful. With the background in, I moved on to our good old boy Springtrap. How many times has this man been burned now? Do we know? Are we keeping count? But here he is again in some fire, looking absolutely miserable about it. He's just accepted his fate, he's done. Anyways, to try to save time on line art, I made sure the sketch was as detailed as possible. Really closely following my reference to make sure everything was correct proportions, correct angles. I really wanted this piece to look good. You know how I said the sketch took 2 hours? And how I said I was making sure that the sketch was really detailed to save time on the line art? Well, the line art alone took 3 hours. Line art is always the thing that takes the longest for me, but 3 hours. And that was actually spread out during the entire day because I had things I had to stop and pause the recording and go do something else and then come back to it. So this technically took all day for me to do just the line art. Seriously, I make my line art way too detailed. I think it's because I'm so conscious about the line art looking flat, and so I do everything I can to make sure it's sort of bold but not too bold so it's cartoony, because I don't want the lines to be too thick, otherwise it looks cartoony, unless that's the style I'm going for deliberately. But here I wasn't, I wanted more realistic, you know, making sure the line weight variation is in and stuff, making sure everything is sort of has these 3D shapes. Just, you know, I just spend so much time on it, and I know I need to try and find ways to probably cut down that time, because art pieces are taking like upwards of 6 hours just to get them done, and most of that is spent on line art, and that's all spread over multiple days because I have other things to do in between. I really gotta find a way to speed some things up. Once again, I started with the background, adding in a bit more detail than I had on the sketch. So I added in the vent, and I added in the checkered pattern on the walls and the floor, and the papers and wires that would be hanging about. I made great use of Sai's line work feature here. Paint Tool Sai has a feature. In fact, I don't know if it's only 2 that has this feature. I use Paint Tool Sai 2. I'm not sure if Paint Tool Sai 1 has it. But if you have Paint Tool Sai, it's a free upgrade to Paint Tool Sai 2, so I would highly recommend it anyway. But yeah, basically you can either make a line work layer, or you can stay on your normal bitmap layer, and you can basically hold shift, you stretch across the line, and then you just tap on your tablet or mouse or whatever you use, and you've got a perfectly straight line at the angle that you wanted it. I used it for the wall separation, the floor separation, the checkered patterns, and honestly doing the method with the shift is way quicker than making the line work layer. So if you have sight and you want some straight lines, I highly recommend that. Just hold shift and there you go. Another tip I can give is something that I did on the wiring. You'll see that I did one line, which is one side of the wires. My voice keeps cracking. But once I'd done that one side of the line, I then copied that line and pasted it onto another layer, moved it along a bit, and then just merged them and put the line underneath to make the solid shape. That way you have this nice consistent shape. You don't have to worry about doing the other line by hand and making sure it's the same and matches. Just do your initial line in a separate layer, copy that over, nudge it over a bit, and then just connect at the bottom, and there you go. You've got your shape. Moving on to Springtrap himself, well, he took, let me actually look at the recording and see how long this took. 2 hours and 20 minutes he took just to line him alone. Honestly though, I think it turned out quite cool. I always like a bit more detailed line art, though I have always wanted to try a liner style where it's purely painted, but I'm not much of a painter. I've just never really been that good at it, traditional or digital, never been much of a painter. I can use watercolours, but that's about it. You know, I've been thinking about making a colouring book that I can put online for you guys to download, and you guys can take my line work and colour it how you want, make your own stuff out of it. Literally like a colouring book that you would get in stores, but it's my work and it's digital. And of course you can then also print it out yourself if you want to do it traditionally. I would do that myself, but I don't actually have a printer. We gave up on printers because they always break and run out of ink, and the ink is so expensive. What's the point? So yeah, that's something I was thinking about, just having my own art online for you guys to download the line art and colour it yourself. I have been thinking about getting my own website going for selling merch and stuff, so yeah, let me know what you think about that. Other than that, really there's not much else to say about the line art process. It's the same as what I do in every single video. Might do a separate video sort of explaining my process and stuff, just a dedicated video to that rather than a speed paint video. But yeah, sit back and enjoy watching me struggle with line art for 2 hours and 20 minutes. finally, I could get onto colouring. As always, I did the base colour first. This is just the general colour, the general tone and hue everything's going to be, and just putting on that base layer so I can use a clipping mask. If you don't know what a clipping mask is, it's basically a layer above your base layer, and you can colour in on that layer, but it will never go outside of the base layer. So it's a separate layer, but it'll never, like your lines and colour and stuff will never go outside of the shape of the layer below. Very helpful tool, highly recommend using it. I then moved on to flat colouring, which is getting the base in for all the little details. So like the wires, his flesh, the eyes, the lenses, the endo, checker patterns on the wall and floor, stuff like that. And then once I've done that, I can use preserve opacity on those layers for the texturing. Preserve opacity is basically the same as a clipping mask, except for it is on the same layer rather than a separate layer. So before I went into the texturing, I decided to map out the fire that was going to be on the piece. I did this because I didn't want to spend ages and ages texturing areas where it's not going to be seen, it's not going to be visible. So I thought if I map out the fire now, I'm going to know what parts to cover it up and I don't have to worry about those parts. So I just mapped out in my line work brush, and then I used a smudge brush to sort of get this wavy effect on it to really make it look like it's heated, waving, slightly sort of translucent haze fire, if that makes sense. Probably not. My brain works in weird ways. But yeah, once that was all mapped out, I went on to the actual texturing. Started off by putting a general full grunge layer over the walls and floor, and then just using my watercolour brush on a sort of messy texture to add in dirt and mould and all these drippy parts, and you know, it's just very dirty, just making it look very dirty. I had to do some children's drawings on the paper. I was doing this live actually on a live stream, and I remember laughing my head off at the toy body. He looks so goofy, but you know what, it works because it's a child's drawing. I did a little reference to the FNAF movie with the yellow rabbit drawing and the crying children that he's holding hands with. I also did the crying child poster from the original game, and I hid a golden Freddy as well. In texture and Springtrap, I decided to focus on his head first and use that as sort of an experiment on how and what textures I wanted to do. With texturing, I don't do this in a way of shading fully. It is some shading, but not completely. I use the texture not only to, well, add a texture, be that fur or cracks or, you know, anything like that, but I also use it to map out the shapes of the creature or character or object or whatever it's going to be. So like here on Spring, I made sure to sort of get that shape of the muzzle going up and just, you know, try to accentuate the actual 3Dness of it. And this is so I don't have to do that in the shading. In the shading, I can just focus purely on where shadows and highlights are going to be. And of course, it's important to make that 3D as well. But if I do this base texturing beforehand, then not only is it almost a guide for me to follow with the shading, but it just helps add that 3D-ness, especially if the shading is just like a shadow of a wire or something. You know, that shadow might look quite flat if I didn't have this base sort of shape underneath it. Now, a tip for those of you that are just getting into art. When you look at something, there are obviously tones that it all have, and you might just look at it as there's a darker tone, there's a lighter tone. So for his endoskeleton, for example, I can look at that and think, oh, there's just a darker grey for the darker areas and the ridges, and a lighter grey for the highlights and the bits that are sticking up. And while that is true, you should also be thinking about other tones and even colours that might be in it. So with the endoskeletons, I try not to make it purely grey. I tried to have a little bit of orange in there, and that's to accentuate a bit of rust. And you can see with the flesh as well, I actually added a bit of green. The green is to show some sort of moulding and rottenness. And you wouldn't think that you'd put green on something that is red, but it would, and it works in the context. So if you're just starting out, I would suggest really look at something and really think about the tones and colours that might be in it. It's not just black and white, it's not just what you see. You could easily end up using a colour that is on the opposite end of the colour wheel to the base colour, and that might work. It's perfectly valid that might work in the context. Like here, the green is almost on the opposite to the red, not quite, but almost, and it works. It is in there, and it's blended in, and it adds that context of a rotten texture. With all the texture and the painting done, it was time to start with the lighting. Obviously this is going to be quite an orange piece. It's going to be the sort of mood of it because you got all this fire. So I just started by adding a overlay layer, which is just an orange colour that I, popped on overlay, stuck it over everything, and just adjusted the opacity until I had it at a point where I liked it. Then I worked on the fire itself just to get an idea of where it's going to be lighter, where it's going to be darker. So I added red underneath the fire to start off with, just to give that sort of glow to it. And then once I'd done that, I went on top of the fire and started adding yellow and white just to shade the fire and get those sort of thicker, brighter parts of it. At first I was going to have it a bit scratchy and painty, but then I realised fire is quite smooth. It's got quite a bit of a gradient to it. It's not rough, it's smooth and flowing. So I ended up blending it all out anyway. I then realised it looked a bit flat, so I ended up adding another layer of fire over top, just to give it a bit more of a 3D feel with the scene. Now, contrary to what you might think, I made it so directly behind the flames were darker. This is because if you think about how a camera might look at something like even your eyes, if you're looking directly at the bright light of a fire, then things behind it are going to look way darker. Try it out if you look at or point a camera at, say, the light bulb on your ceiling or something, or a lamp. That lamp is going to look really bright, but the things around it might end up looking a bit dimmer and darker. They're not, obviously, they don't change in their lighting, but it's just how our eyes and cameras perceive things. And so I got that effect by putting a bit of a darker shade in behind the fire. I also had to think about where the light source was coming from the fire. So obviously there's going to be a shadow on everything because there's bright light in front of it, but technically the fire is coming from all sides. It's coming from in front, it's coming from the left, it's coming from the right. So if you think about that, there's going to be sort of multiple shadows to think about. So basically on either side of each thing that was sticking out in front of the wall, I put a shadow. One shadow slightly more translucent than the other shadow. And basically this does give the idea that the fire is coming from both sides. It's coming from in front, it's coming from the left, it's coming from the right. There's not just one flat shadow to look at, there are multiple shadows being cast here. When I went on to shading sprint, I tried to think about where all the lighting is coming from, again, which is an obvious thing to say. I don't know why I need to say that, but I also now had shapes and stuff to follow. So not only have I got to think about where the light is shining and how that's going to add highlights and shadows, I also had to think about the fact that some things are within the suit and that's going to be darker anyway. There's less light getting into the suit, you know, that's sort of by default. So I had to add more shadows in there than I would on the outside of the suit. Once I had all that sort of general idea in, the refined shading was a lot easier. Since I'd already darkened inside the suit, it actually did sort of allow for this contrast. The outside did look lighter than the inside, and that's a lot more realistic, and I really liked the effect that made. I just may sort of exaggerate that a bit with the refined shading. Also with the refined shading, I can make much harsher highlights, which would fit the very bright light of the fire. It just gives this nice sort of idea that there's this very, very, very bright light shining on him, and there is. And those harsh highlights just really, well, highlight. Of course, they highlight. They highlight the shapes and the parts of the suit that, you know, that light is really bouncing off of. As for final touches, I added a general sort of shade of a yellow over the top because it looked a little bit unrealistic, so adding this shade sort of adds a bit of a haze and just gives it a bit more realism because the line art gets a bit of shading on it then. And other final touches was some embers basically floating around. I brightened up the fire a little bit, and then finally I used my line art brush to add some even more harsher highlights of both a sort of pale orange and a white colour on things that would be a bit shinier, like the wires and, well, the wires and the metal parts. Yeah, that was the final thing I did, and enjoyed the last bit of speed paint, and you'll see the final product. There we go, that is the Sprint Chat art for this month of November. Quite happy with how it turned out. It could have been better, but it's not bad. Let me know in the comments what you think of it. Anyways, I don't have much more to say, so thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. If you could like, subscribe, leave a comment, that'd be amazing. You would help boost me in the algorithm, get more people watching my videos, and I'd really, really appreciate that support. But yeah, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!